ship wasn't under attack. That was the problem. Commander Yara Osei had been awake for 19 hours, watching the Covenant fleet hold position just outside weapons range. 47 vessels. Not moving, not communicating, not doing anything a fleet does when it intends to negotiate or withdraw. Just watching. "They've been stationary for 6 hours," said Lieutenant Prakash Nair from the sensor station, his voice carrying that particular flatness people develop when they've stopped knowing how to feel afraid. No power fluctuations, no targeting locks, no communication bursts on any frequency we can detect. "We can detect everything," Yara said. "Yes, ma'am." That was the thing that kept pulling at her. The Covenant didn't know humans could detect everything. That was supposed to be the advantage the passive array Lieutenant Commander Adisa had spent 4 years developing. The one that could read a ship's internal temperature variations from 11,000 kilometers and translate them into crew activity patterns. The Covenant had never encountered it before. They didn't know it existed. So why weren't they doing anything worth detecting? "Adisa." Yara turned from the main viewport. The stars beyond it looked wrong, too still, too indifferent. "What are the internal readings telling you?" Lieutenant Commander Kwame Adisa was a small man who moved like he was always slightly apologetic about taking up space. He'd grown up in Accra, studied signals theory at Bangalore, and once spent 8 months alone on a monitoring station in the outer belt cataloging radiation patterns from a dying star. He was the calmest person Yara had ever met, which was either a profound asset or a deep warning sign, and she'd never fully decided which. He looked up from his console. His expression was the careful kind, the kind where the face is doing a lot of work to stay neutral. "They're having a meeting," he said. "A meeting. All 47 ships. Some kind of synchronized resonance pulse. It's too low frequency to be a weapon, too structured to be random. They're talking, all of them simultaneously, in a way we've never recorded before." Yara crossed the bridge in 6 steps and stood behind him. On his screen, the readout showed 47 overlapping wave patterns, each distinct but rhythmically interlocked. It looked, she thought, the way a choir sounds, individual voices folded into something collective. How long has this been happening? Since they stopped. 6 hours. They'd been talking for 6 hours. "About what?" she said, knowing he couldn't know, asking anyway because the asking sometimes helped. Adisa was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think they're deciding something." The ship shuddered. Not from impact, not from engine surge. A single, localized tremor, deck 4, forward section, just below the secondary cargo bay. Yara's hand went to the console edge before she consciously decided to move. "Report. Pressure differential on deck 4, said Ensign Morrow from damage control, young enough that her voice still climbed when she was scared. "Minor. Seal integrity at 94%. It's Commander, it's the brig." Yara was already moving. The brig on the Resilient held 3 cells and a narrow corridor that smelled permanently of recycled air and old anxiety. When Yara arrived 2 minutes, 30 seconds after the tremor, she'd been counting. The guard outside cell 2, a broad-shouldered corporal named Tesfaye, was standing at a distance from the door that suggested he'd recently been significantly closer to it. "What happened?" "It spoke," Tesfaye said. "Ma'am, it spoke. The Covenant prisoner in cell 2 had been aboard for 11 days. They'd taken it." Yara was aware of how wrong the pronoun was and used it anyway, because the alternatives felt like they were claiming more than she knew. During the skirmish at Kepler Station, it had been aboard a scout vessel. The scout vessel had not survived the engagement, which was a fact that produced no satisfaction because the scout vessel had contained 11 other Covenant individuals, and 11 deaths in exchange for 1 prisoner felt like a bad ratio for everyone involved. The prisoner was approximately 2 meters tall, roughly bipedal in the sense that it had a lower structure that could be used for standing and an upper structure that could be used for doing things, though the specifics of both were sufficiently different from human anatomy that the similarity felt more like a philosophical argument than a practical description. Its integument, skin, was too simple a word, shifted color in slow, complex patterns. The medics had determined it wasn't communication exactly, More like emotion made visible, like the body narrating its own internal state to anyone who knew how to read it. For 11 days, it had been still, responsive to basic stimuli, accepting of food, producing the slow teal and amber pattern that the medics had cautiously categorized as not immediately distressed. It had not communicated. It had not resisted. It had simply existed in its cell with the patience of something that understood, waiting in a way humans were not built to understand. Now it was standing at the cell barrier, the energy field that separated it from the corridor, and its integument was cycling through colors Yara had never seen it produce. Fast, almost frantic by comparison to its previous stillness. Gold, white, deep violet, something that had no name in the spectrum charts. Yara walked to the barrier, stopped a meter from it. The prisoner looked at her. It had what might be called eyes, bilateral sensory clusters that had proven capable of detecting frequencies humans couldn't produce, and for 11 days those clusters had tracked her with neutral attention whenever she visited. Now they were fixed on her with something that felt, despite everything she knew about the danger of projecting, like urgency that IT made a sound, not words. The Covenant communicated through a combination of subsonic resonance, chemical signal, and structural color that human vocal anatomy couldn't replicate and human ears only partially caught. But the sound it made was something deliberate, shaped. Adisa, Yara said without turning. She hadn't realized he'd followed her. He was standing 3 steps behind, his tablet already active. Are you recording? Yes. The prisoner made the sound again. Different this time. Shorter. Then it did something that made Tesfaye step back another half meter. It raised one of its upper limbs slowly, with the careful deliberateness of something that understood it was making a gesture that could be misread, and pressed the limb flat against the energy barrier. The barrier flickered where it touched. Didn't fail, but acknowledged the contact. It was, Yara realized, the Covenant equivalent of knocking. It wants to tell us something, she said. Yes, said Adisa, and I think it's urgent. How do you know? He turned his tablet toward her. On the screen, the 47 wave patterns from the fleet outside had changed. They were no longer interlocked. They were converging. Whatever the fleet had been deciding for 6 hours, they decided. The next 4 hours were the most intensive translation work in human history, which was a statement that required significant qualification because most of the actual work was done by a combination of the resilience linguistics AI and Adisa's intuitive leaps, and significant portions of what they extracted might charitably be described as interpretation rather than translation. But the shape of it was clear enough. The Covenant fleet outside was not waiting to attack. It was not posturing. It was not engaged in some strategic maneuver that would make sense once you could see the full board. It was waiting to leave. Walk me through it again, Yara said. She was in the small conference room adjacent to the bridge, sitting across from Adisa and the ship's senior staff. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Priya Venkataraman, who had handled most of the prisoners' medical assessments. Tactical Officer Major Desmond Achterberg, who had handled the Kepler Station engagement and still wore the look of someone who hadn't fully put it down yet, and Navigator First Class Svetlana Kozer, who had been requested because she'd spent 3 years prior to her naval commission studying xenolinguistics at the University of Edinburgh and had opinions. The fleet convened, Adisa said, because a decision needed to be made collectively. The Covenant don't have command hierarchies the way we do. Decisions of, I want to say, sufficient weight, though that's an interpretation, are made through something closer to consensus. Every ship, every crew, simultaneously. 6 hours of consensus, Kozer said. She was frowning at her own copy of the translation. That's either very complicated or very divided. Both, the prisoner suggests. Both. And the decision? Yara said. Adisa set down his tablet. He had the look of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for 4 hours and was now placing it on a table to share the weight. They're withdrawing from this system, and with some significant caveats about translation confidence from this entire region. From us. He paused. Not tactically. Not temporarily. Permanently. The room was quiet. Why? Dr. Venkataraman asked. Because of what we did at Kepler Station. Desmond Achterberg, who had handled Kepler Station, went very still. The engagement at Kepler Station had been, by any military metric, a human victory. The Covenant had arrived with superior numbers and firepower. They had expected. This was the part the prisoners' communication had spent considerable effort conveying, a straightforward engagement to conclude a boundary dispute. The Covenant conducted warfare with something approaching ritual structure. There were patterns, established sequences of escalation, resistance, and resolution that all parties understood and operated within. Humans had not operated within them. "Tell them what we did," Achterberg said quietly. "Tell them what I did. Specifically." "The prisoner's communication focuses less on specific actions," Adisa said carefully, "and more on, I keep coming back to the word incomprehensibility. What humans did at Kepler Station wasn't just tactically unexpected. It violated the fundamental logic of how warfare is supposed to work. The Covenant have been a spacefaring civilization for 11,000 years. They have fought wars with 4 other species. They have frameworks for conflict, rules of engagement that aren't rules, exactly. They're more like physics, things that are true because they have always been true. And we broke them," Kozer said. "We didn't even know they existed," Yara said. "That," said Adisa, "is what frightened them." Achterberg stood up and walked to the small porthole. Outside, stars. Somewhere in that direction, 47 ships. He spoke without turning. "At Kepler Station, I had 40 personnel, 2 functional weapons platforms, and a station that was going to be overrun in approximately 20 minutes. The Covenant had 6 vessels and were executing a standard. What I now gather was a standard approach pattern. So I blew the station." Silence. Not a controlled detonation. I overloaded the main reactor and vented the fuel cells simultaneously through the docking ports in a pattern designed to create interlocking detonation waves. I destroyed my own position. I destroyed significant portions of my own equipment. I killed. The casualty count was 11 on our side. He stopped. I destroyed 2 of their 6 vessels. I crippled a 3rd. And I got my remaining personnel out through the maintenance shafts, while the Covenant were still trying to determine what had happened. "You won," Yara said. "I won," Achterberg said. He still wasn't looking at them. "And apparently, no species in 11,000 years of Covenant warfare has ever deliberately destroyed their own position to gain tactical advantage." Yara looked at Adisa. "That's what the prisoner is telling us. That's why they're withdrawing." "Not exactly." Adisa picked up his tablet again. "The prisoner is telling us that the fleet's consensus conclusion was this. Humans cannot be engaged with. Not because humans are too strong. Not because the cost is too high. Because humans fight in a way that the Covenant have no framework for understanding. And a war you cannot understand is not a war. It is something else. Something the Covenant have no word for." "What do they have a word for?" Kozer asked. Adisa read from his tablet. "The closest translation I can construct is, a force that does not know it is a force." Another silence. This one had a different texture. "They're afraid of us," Dr. Venkataraman said slowly. "But not because we're powerful. Because we're incoherent," Yara said. "Because we're incoherent," Adisa confirmed. "And they cannot calculate incoherence." It should have been good news. Yara spent an hour trying to make it feel like good news. She walked the ship, which she did sometimes when she needed to think through something that resisted being thought through while sitting still. She walked the length of the maintenance corridor on Deck 2, which was 340 meters and smelled of machine oil and the particular metallic cold of deep space pressing against hull. She walked past the small informal memorial the engineering crew had built near Junction 7 for their 3 colleagues who died at Callisto 9 3 years ago. Small frame photographs, a piece of colored cloth from someone's home country, a child's drawing that someone had laminated. She walked past the mess hall, where Ensign Morrow was sitting alone with cold coffee and an expression suggesting she hadn't entirely processed the day's events. She stopped in the corridor outside and knocked on the open doorframe. Morrow looked up. "Commander, how are you?" "Honestly, preferably. Terrified. Not of the Covenant leaving." She looked at her coffee. "Of all of it. The whole shape of it. We did something at Kepler Station that frightened a civilization 11,000 years old. They decided, all of them, that humans are what? Unknowable. And that's our win condition. Yara sat down across from her. The mess hall was empty except for them. The overhead light had a faint flicker that had been on the maintenance list for 3 weeks. What would you prefer? Yara asked. That they fought us. No, I'd prefer they understood us. That's what I can't make feel like good news, Yara said. Morrow, go off the record for a minute. The ensign looked at her. Off the record, ma'am? This conversation isn't happening. I'm just walking the ship. You're drinking bad coffee. A small, fragile, real smile. The coffee is genuinely terrible, ma'am. Off the record. I don't know if we want something today or confirmed something terrible about ourselves. And I suspect it might be both. And I think both of those things are equally true, and I'm not sure how to hold them. Morrow was quiet for a moment. Then, my grandmother used to say that wisdom is what you call it when you can hold two opposite true things without needing one of them to lose. Yara looked at her. She also said her Wi-Fi password was password 123. Morrow added, so maybe take that with appropriate context. Yara laughed. It surprised her. Real laughter, unguarded. The kind that comes from a place that doesn't know it's about to laugh until it does. She laughed and Morrow laughed too, and the flickering light flickered above them, and outside the ship 47 Covenant vessels held position while humanity's fate was in the process of being decided by forces neither of them could fully see. Get some sleep, Yara said, standing. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. Are they all going to be complicated from here, ma'am? Yara considered this honestly. Almost certainly yes. At 0340 ship time, Adisa found her in the observatory. A small, rarely used compartment near the ship's spine, barely large enough for 4 people, where someone in the ship's original design had included a section of actual transparent hull. Not a screen, not a projection, actual physical transparency. The stars visible through it were real. He sat down beside her without being invited, which meant he had something to say that he'd been deciding how to say for several hours. The prisoner asked about you, he said. About me specifically? About who was in authority. Whether the person who commands this ship was the same person who commanded the engagement at Kepler Station. I wasn't at Kepler Station. I told it that. It asked, and the translation here is approximate. Whether you were aware of what happened there, whether you sanctioned it, whether it was, in any sense, chosen. Yara looked at the stars. What did you tell it? The truth. That I didn't know. That those decisions were made under conditions of, he paused. I said necessity. The prisoner was quiet for a long time after that. Then it said, and I want to be clear, this is my best approximation of something that doesn't have a direct linguistic equivalent. It said that the Covenant fleet's greatest fear is that your actions are not aberrations. They're not, Yara said. I know. Achterberg did what he did because it was the only option that got his people out. Any one of us would have done the same. Most of us have done something like it, in one context or another. She pressed one hand against the transparent hull. The cold came through immediately, the real cold of space barely held back by a few centimeters of engineering. The Covenant fought 4 other species over 11,000 years. In all that time, they never encountered anyone who would deliberately destroy their own position to survive. It's the pack bonding, Adisa said. I've been thinking about this. Every other species the Covenant engaged with had a self-preservation calculation that placed individual survival above collective survival in moments of genuine extremity. When faced with destruction, they chose the version of destruction that preserved the most of themselves. Achterberg chose the version that saved his people at maximum cost to himself and his position. Humans don't. We don't calculate like that. No, we never have. There's this old study. I read it in training, from before the first contact era. Psychologists kept running these scenarios: burning building, drowning child, runaway vehicle, and they found that human beings consistently overrode self-preservation instinct in situations involving others they'd formed attachments to. Consistently. across cultures, ages, backgrounds. It didn't make logical sense from an individual survival standpoint, and it kept happening anyway. Because we're a pack species, Yara said. Because we are, yes, and the Covenant aren't. Or they're a collective species, which is different. They decide together, but they don't sacrifice for each other. Not the way we do. The self is still the fundamental unit. He paused. The prisoner's integument has been doing something I haven't seen before, since it started communicating. A kind of deep blue, slowly cycling. The medics think it might be what grief looks like in their physiology. Yara turned to look at him. Grief for what? I think, Adisa said carefully, for the 11,000 years. She didn't understand for a moment. Then she did. For 11,000 years of warfare, conducted according to rules that made sense, that had logic, that could be navigated and survived and ended. 11,000 years of conflict as something comprehensible. And now, at the edge of this particular dark, a species that fought without the rules, that would burn down its own house to save its family, that could not be predicted or calculated or understood. The prisoner was grieving the end of a world in which war made sense. Does it know, Yara asked, that we would have preferred not to fight at all? I tried to communicate something like that. What did it say? Adisa was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. It said, he finally said, that all the species the Covenant ever fought preferred not to fight. That preference has never prevented war. He exhaled slowly. Then it said something I've been sitting with for 2 hours. Tell me. It said, but you are the first who would have sacrificed yourselves to prevent it, and we did not know that either. The stars outside the transparent hull burned there silent, in different fires across distances that made human pain seem very small and somehow also very large. What does that change? Yara asked, not rhetorically, actually asking. I think, Adisa said, everything. And I think we need to figure out what to do with that before the fleet leaves, because once they're gone, the message they carry about us is the message. Yes. She went back to the brig at 0500. Tesfaye was still on guard, which meant he'd been on post for something like 12 hours and was running on military discipline and what Yara suspected was significant amounts of poor-quality stimulant. She'd deal with that afterward. She dismissed him to the corridor's far end and stood alone outside Cell 2. The prisoner was watching her. The deep blue cycling on its integument was slower now, almost meditative. Yara had spent the walk from the observatory deciding how to do this. She'd run through the options, get Adisa, use the translation equipment, go through proper process. All of those options were correct. All of them were also slow and mediated, and she was standing here with something important to say, and she wasn't sure the proper process would carry the weight of it. She pressed her hand flat against the energy barrier, the way the prisoner had done. The barrier flickered. The prisoner looked at her hand, then at her face. She spoke, knowing it couldn't understand the words, knowing that wasn't entirely the point. We don't want to fight you, she said. We never did. I know you can't understand that from what you've seen, because what you've seen is, I know how it looks. I know that a species willing to destroy its own position to survive looks like a species that doesn't value anything enough to protect it carefully. She paused. But it's the opposite. We destroy the position because the people inside it matter more. We fight beyond logic because the things we're fighting for matter beyond logic. We are not a war species. We are a love species that is very, very bad at being threatened. The prisoner's integument shifted. The deep blue remained, but something else moved through it, a color she couldn't name, low and warm. I don't expect you to understand that. I'm not even sure I understand it most days. She looked at the hand against the barrier. The cold of the field ran up through her palm. But when your fleet leaves, whatever you tell them about us, I hope some part of this gets there. That we are afraid too. That we have things we love and are terrified of losing. That everything you saw at Kepler Station was terror, not strength. She took her hand from the barrier. The prisoner made a sound, not the urgent, structured sound from earlier, something quieter. Lower. The sound, she thought, of something that had been heard. Whether it understood any specific word, almost certainly not. Whether the gesture, cadence, the plain human fact of one person trying to communicate across a distance that shouldn't be crossable. She'd never know, probably. But the deep blue on its integument settled slowly into something that the medics would later, reviewing the recording, cautiously describe as calm. At 0800, the fleet moved, not toward them, away. 47 vessels executing this synchronized departure pattern. Adisa watched his sensor array with an expression of focused attention and said it was, in its own way, beautiful. The way each ship's movement accounted for and complemented every other ship's movement. 47 independent entities moving as a single thought. The last ship to move was the one positioned at the fleet's geometric center. It paused, impossibly, Adisa said. It paused. Ships don't pause when executing a departure sequence. There was no tactical reason for it. For 11 seconds before following the others. Why 11 seconds? Kozer asked. I don't know, Adisa said. They watched until the fleet was gone from visual range, then from sensor range, then from the passive array's extraordinary reach. They watched until there was nothing left to watch. The Resilient sat alone in the emptiness between systems, and the bridge crew performed the small rituals that bridge crews perform, updating logs, running system checks, communicating status reports to Fleet Command, and nobody said much about what had just happened because most of them were still in the process of figuring out what to say. Yara stood at the main viewport and looked at the space where 47 ships had been. Commander, it was Ensign Morrow, at her station, voice carefully professional. There's something on the passive array. Adisa, can you confirm? Adisa was already at his console, and his expression was the particular expression of a man looking at something that doesn't fit in any category he currently has available. It's a signal, he said. Low frequency. Structured. Not aimed at us specifically. Aimed at the general region. It's using the same resonance pattern as the fleet's internal communication. But it's not the fleet. He looked up. It's coming from the prisoner. Everyone on the bridge turned toward him. It's broadcasting, Adisa said. Some kind of low-power resonance from inside the cell. The barrier's been attenuating it, but not fully blocking it. It's been broadcasting since approximately 0530 ship time. Approximately 0530. Approximately when Yara had been standing at the barrier. What is it saying? Yara asked. Adisa sat with the translation for 4 minutes that felt considerably longer. The bridge was quiet in the specific way that bridges get quiet when everyone is aware that something significant is happening, and nobody wants to interrupt the process of figuring out what it is. Then Adisa looked up, and his expression was something Yara had no name for, something that lived in the territory between wonder and grief and hope, in the place where those three things become indistinguishable. It's saying, as closely as I can translate, that the commander of the human vessel pressed her hand against the barrier, and then spoke without expectation of being understood. And that's something. He stopped, looked at the screen again. That something should be known of that. Yara said nothing. It was telling the fleet, Adisa said, or whatever can receive this frequency. It was broadcasting a record. Of you. Of what you did. Of the fact that you... He exhaled. The translation gets imprecise here, but that you came alone, without your translation systems, without protocol, just a person who wanted to be heard trying to be heard. A record, Yara said. Of something the Covenant have apparently never encountered. A war maker trying to explain their own fear. He looked at her. It sent this before the fleet left, which means the fleet has it, which means wherever they go. Wherever they go. The viewport held empty space. The stars were doing what stars always do, burning, steady, indifferent to the small and significant things that happen in the dark between them. Achterberg, from his station, said quietly, "We still don't know if they'll come back." "No," Yara said. "We don't know what they'll do with what they have now, whether it changes anything." "No. Could go either way." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, You know what I think about sometimes? When I can't sleep after Kepler Station, I think about those 11 people on my side, and I think about the crews of the 2 Covenant ships, and I think about how none of them on either side, wanted to be there. None of them chose it, and they still. I know, Yara said. How do you keep going after something like that? It was a genuine question, from a person who'd been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and was asking because he needed an answer, not because he expected one. Yara turned from the viewport to face him, Major Desmond Achterberg, who had saved 29 people by destroying everything else, who had won a battle in a way that frightened a civilization older than human writing, who looked, right now, like a person who would very much like to not be the person who did that. Because the alternative, she said, is that it didn't mean anything, and I can't live in that universe. He looked at her for a long moment, nodded once, the kind of nod that isn't agreement, exactly, but is something adjacent to it, the acknowledgement that a thing has been received. Commander. It was Morrow again, and her voice had changed. The prisoner is requesting something. Adisa, can you? Adisa was already translating, moving fast. It's requesting, he said, to be returned. Returned, Yara said, to the Covenant. It's asking if. It wants to know if we will. He paused. It's asking if we let things go. Yara crossed to the sensor station, looked at the readout. The fleet was gone. The system was empty. The prisoner was alone on a ship full of humans who had inadvertently become legend to a civilization 11,000 years old, and it was asking if they let things go. Tell it, Yara said. Yes. Ma'am, releasing a prisoner of war without authorization from Fleet Command. I know what it is, Lieutenant. The protocols are not the point right now. She looked at Adisa. Tell it yes, and ask it if it has a way to call them back. Adisa transmitted, waited. The prisoner's response came in the slow, structured resonance pattern. Adisa said, it says it always had a way to call them back. Morrow made a small sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else entirely. Of course it did, Kozer said. It was waiting, Adisa said, still reading the translation, to see if we would ask. It says, in approximate terms, that people who do not know when to release a thing they hold cannot be trusted with the knowledge of what they hold. He looked up. It's a test. It's been a test. The whole 11 days. The bridge processed this. What were we being tested for? Achterberg asked. Adisa read again, and said, whether we are a species that learns the same way we fight, whether we can be, I keep wanting to translate this as taught, whether we can be taught. And the prisoner intends to tell them yes. The Covenant vessel that returned was a single ship, smaller than a scout. It arrived at the edge of sensor range approximately 6 hours after the prisoner's signal went out, and it held position at a distance that was, Adisa noted, exactly the minimum distance at which the passive array's resolution became insufficient to read internal activity. They've done their research, Kozer said, or the prisoner told them. Yara said, the transfer happened in the space between the ships, using a shuttle that Yara piloted herself. She hadn't explained that decision to anyone, and nobody had asked, though she'd seen Achterberg's expression when she'd announced it and understood that he understood. The Covenant vessel sent a shuttle to meet them. Small. 2 occupants, neither of whom showed any integument color that Yara could read with confidence. They were wearing something that covered most of the relevant surface area, which she chose to interpret as cultural formality rather than hostile intent. The transfer was wordless. The prisoner moved from the human shuttle to the Covenant shuttle with the same careful deliberateness it had shown in every movement since they'd taken it aboard. Economical, considered, without waste. At the threshold, it stopped. It turned back to look at Yara. Its integument produced one color, one she'd never seen before. It lasted 3 seconds. Then the shuttle door closed, and it was gone. She flew the human shuttle back to the Resilient alone with the stars, and the question of what that color had meant. Adisa met her at the docking bay. Did you see the reading from a shuttle sensor? I was flying the shuttle. Right. Sorry. I recorded it. He held up his tablet. 1.7 seconds of that color. I ran it through everything we have. He paused. It doesn't appear in any of our Covenant behavioral records. It's not in any existing xenolinguistic database. It has no documented reference. Yara pulled off her flight gloves. The docking bay smelled of fuel and metal and the faint recycled air scent that all compartments eventually acquired. So we don't know what it means. Not from existing records, no. He hesitated. But I have a theory. Based on, not data exactly, based on context. Tell me your theory, Adisa. The color appeared after 11 days of observation. After you came alone to speak without expectation of being understood. After we agreed to release it. At the moment of departure. He lowered his tablet. I think it might be the Covenant word for hope. Or something in that neighborhood. I don't think they have a direct equivalent for hope the way we do. It might be something more like the recognition of a possible future not yet proven. Yara looked at the closed docking bay door through which the prisoner had passed and was now gone. That's a very human concept, she said. Yes, Adisa said. I think that might be what it was saying. The Resilient filed its report with Fleet Command 40 minutes later. Yara wrote it herself, which was unusual, and wrote it in plain language, which was also unusual, and spent 2 hours writing a version in protocol standard format before deleting it and starting again. She wrote, "We encountered a Covenant fleet of 47 vessels. No engagement occurred. The fleet withdrew. This was not a tactical withdrawal. The attached translation records will explain more fully than I can in summary. I am submitting this as a direct report because I believe the standard classification frameworks do not contain adequate categories for what occurred here today, and I am unwilling to reduce it to a category that doesn't fit. What I can say with confidence is this: we were seen, not as a military force and not as a threat. We were seen as what we are, which is a species that is afraid and loves things, and will do unreasonable things to protect what it loves, and that is apparently, to at least one other civilization in this galaxy, remarkable. I do not know yet whether this is good. I believe it may be the most important thing that has happened in the 11 years since first contact. I believe we have been given something rare, a chance to be understood before we are decided. I recommend we proceed with care." She sent it. Then she sat back in her command chair and looked at the empty space where 47 ships had been, and one had returned briefly, and then departed, carrying something she couldn't fully name. The stars were still burning, still indifferent, still covering distances that made everything seem both very small and very large. Morrow at her station said, "Ma'am, what do we do now?" Yara thought about 11,000 years. She thought about Achterberg's 29 people and the 2 crews who weren't here anymore. She thought about the deep blue cycling color of grief and the one unrecorded color at a threshold. She thought about her grandmother's Wi-Fi password. No, that wasn't hers. That was Morrow's. But it had the same quality, the same sudden humanness in the middle of something immense. She thought about what it meant to be a species that didn't know it was a force. "We figure out," she said, "how to be what that color meant." Morrow glanced at Kozer. Kozer glanced at Adisa. Adisa looked at his tablet for a moment, then up at the viewport. "Hope," Morrow said. "The recognition of a possible future not yet proven." Yara said, "Yes." The Resilient held its position in the empty dark, alone in the way that anything is alone when what surrounds it hasn't yet arrived, and the crew went about their work, and the stars burned, and somewhere beyond the edges of the sensor array, 47 ships were carrying something remarkable home.